The rain in Greenwich didn't just fall. It orchestrated a symphony of cold, calculated indifference. It was a torrential downpour that turned the manicured lawns of the Blackstone estate into a sodden, weeping landscape. Inside the mansion, a Neo-Palladian monolith of white marble and reinforced glass, Catherine Blackstone stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand foyer. She wasn't looking at the storm. She was watching the reflection of the woman she had spent 10 years becoming. Polished, stoic, and utterly invisible to the man who shared her bed. Her reflection was framed by the opulent crown moulding, a literal gold-leafed cage. At 34, Catherine possessed a bone-deep elegance that no amount of marital neglect could erode. But tonight, the elegance felt like a shroud. In her hand, she held a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25, Richard's favourite, the amber liquid catching the rhythmic flashes of lightning that periodically bleached the world outside. Then, the headlights appeared. 2 predatory beams of a Bentley Continental GT cut through the obsidian curtain of the storm. Catherine didn't move. She didn't flinch when the heavy mahogany doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of ozone-charged air and the sharp, metallic scent of the rain. Richard Blackstone entered first. He was a man built on the scaffolding of generational wealth and a sociopathic level of self-assurance. His tailored charcoal suit was barely damp, protected by the umbrella held by a driver he had likely already forgotten the name of. But he wasn't alone. Clinging to his arm like a decorative, poisonous vine was Amber Vance. She was younger, louder, and smelled of a perfume so cloyingly sweet it felt like an assault on the room's sophisticated air. Amber was wearing a slip dress that cost more than a teacher's annual salary, and her eyes, vibrant with a cruel sort of triumph, immediately began surveying the foyer as if she were already mentally measuring for new curtains. "Catherine," Richard said, his voice a dry rasp that carried the weight of a corporate merger. He didn't look at her. He looked through her. "I see you haven't started packing." Catherine took a slow, measured sip of the scotch. The burn in her throat was the only heat in the room. "The weather is hardly conducive to travel, Richard, and I don't recall receiving an eviction notice." Richard laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a gravestone. He guided Amber further into the hall, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. "This isn't a legal proceeding, Catherine. It's a foreclosure, on our marriage, on this life. Amber needs the master suite. She finds the city apartment claustrophobic." Amber let out a high-pitched, practiced giggle. "It's just so beige, Richie. This place has character. Though we'll definitely need to do something about the art. It's a bit depressing." She gestured vaguely at a multi-million-dollar Rothko that Catherine had acquired 3 years ago. "The art stays, Amber," Catherine said quietly. "Every piece in this house has its place, its history." Richard stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. The facade of the perfect gentleman was slipping, revealing the jagged edges of the man who had built Blackstone Holdings on the ruins of smaller families. "The history is over. I've had the lawyers draft the papers. You'll find them in the morning at your new residence, which, incidentally, is wherever you decide to land tonight." He reached out and snatched the crystal tumbler from Catherine's hand. He didn't drink from it. Instead, he tilted it, letting the expensive scotch pour slowly onto the white Carrara marble floor. It pooled there, a golden stain on a pristine surface. "Get out," Richard commanded. "Now." "It's raining, Richard," Catherine observed, her voice devoid of the tremor he was clearly looking for. "A literal deluge." "Then you'll get wet," he snapped. He signaled to the 2 security guards standing by the door. Men Catherine had vetted, men she had paid bonuses to for years. They looked at the floor, unable to meet her gaze, but they stepped forward nonetheless. "Mrs. Blackstone," one of them whispered. "Please." Richard took Catherine's arm. His grip was tight, the kind of pressure that would leave a phantom bruise by midnight. He marched her toward the open door. Amber followed, a smirk playing on her lips, her eyes dancing with the sadistic joy of a child pulling wings off a fly. As they reached the threshold, the wind whipped Catherine's silk blouse against her skin. The cold was instantaneous, a physical shock that slowed her heart rate. Richard shoved her. It wasn't a violent throw, but a dismissive one, a push that signaled she was no longer a person in his eyes, but a piece of discarded inventory. Catherine stumbled onto the wet gravel of the driveway. The rain drenched her in seconds, plastering her dark hair to her face. Behind her, the warmth of the foyer glowed like a forbidden sanctuary. "Don't bother calling the accounts, Catherine," Richard shouted over the roar of the storm. "I've frozen everything. The credit cards, the trust, the stipends. You're leaving with exactly what you've contributed to this marriage. Nothing." He slammed the door. The sound of the heavy mahogany meeting the frame was like a gavel coming down in a final judgment. The locks clicked, a series of high-tech electronic chirps that signaled the total revocation of her access. Catherine stood in the driveway, the rain blinding her. She could see them through the glass panels. Richard, with his arm around Amber, leading her up the grand staircase toward the room where Catherine had slept for a decade. She saw Amber stop, turn, and blow a mocking kiss toward the window before they disappeared into the shadows of the upper gallery. Most women would have screamed. Most would have pounded on the glass until their knuckles bled, or collapsed into the mud, weeping at the sudden, total annihilation of their world. Catherine Blackstone did neither. She stood perfectly still, letting the water soak through her clothes until she was shivering violently. And then, slowly, she began to smile. It wasn't a smile of madness. It was the smile of a grandmaster who had just watched their opponent fall for a gambit, 10 moves in the making. Richard thought he had stripped her bare. He thought he had taken the house, the money, the status. He thought he was the one doing the throwing away. What he didn't know, what his high-priced forensic accountants had failed to see because they were looking for traditional embezzlement, was that Catherine had started dismantling the Blackstone empire 18 months ago. She hadn't just moved money. She had moved assets. The very marble he was standing on, the Rothko Amber hated, the Bentley in the garage, and the title to the Greenwich mansion itself. They didn't belong to Richard Blackstone anymore. They belonged to a series of offshore holding companies, layered behind trusts, registered in jurisdictions that Richard's lawyers couldn't even find on a map. Through a masterful display of wash trading and the strategic use of shell corporations like Lumina Global and Ebon Crest Holdings, Catherine had effectively sold the house to herself under a different name. Richard was currently a squatter in a mansion owned by his destitute ex-wife. The frozen accounts he spoke of were shells. Catherine had bled them dry months ago, replacing the liquidity with synthetic assets that looked real on a balance sheet, but were essentially worthless junk bonds. She had used his own ego against him, knowing he would never look at the fine print of the restructuring documents she had placed among his nightly briefings, documents he signed while distracted by Amber's texts or the glow of the stock ticker. Catherine reached into the hidden pocket of her damp slacks and pulled out a small, waterproof burner phone. She swiped the screen. A single notification was waiting for her. Transaction complete. 100% disposal of Blackstone Realty Corp. Proceeds. Diverted to encrypted ledger. The amount was staggering. It was enough to buy 10 such mansions. It was enough to bury Richard Blackstone under a mountain of debt he wouldn't realize he had until the first notice of seizure arrived in 48 hours. She looked up at the darkened windows of the master suite. Richard thought he was the hunter. He thought he had won the game by changing the locks. "Oh, Richard," Catherine whispered into the rain, her voice lost in the thunder. "You didn't just throw me out. You walked into the vault and locked the door from the inside, and I'm the only one with the code." She turned and began walking down the long, winding driveway. She didn't look back. A few hundred yards away, hidden in the shadows of a weeping willow, a black SUV waited. The driver wasn't a Blackstone employee. He was a specialist she had hired out of London, a man who dealt in disappearances and high-stakes transitions. As she reached the car, the door opened. The interior was warm, smelling of leather and expensive coffee. Catherine climbed in, the water from her clothes dripping onto the floorboards. "Everything settled, Ma'am?" the driver asked, his voice a low rumble. Catherine looked at the reflection of the mansion in the side mirror, the white pillars standing like the ribs of a dying beast. "No, Elias," she said, leaning back into the heated seat. "The settling hasn't even begun. Tonight was just the opening credit. Tomorrow, we start the audit." She closed her eyes as the SUV pulled away, leaving the Blackstone estate behind. The storm continued to rage, but for the first time in 10 years, Catherine Blackstone felt perfectly, dangerously dry. The irony was delicious. Richard had spent his life believing that power was about who sat at the head of the table. Catherine knew the truth. Power was about who owned the table, the chairs, and the floor they sat on. And as of 8:01 p.m. tonight, Richard Blackstone was sitting on nothing but air. The forensic trail she had left was a masterpiece of obfuscation. She had used layering techniques that mimicked the natural volatility of the market. To any outside observer, it would look like Richard's own aggressive investment strategies had backfired. She had even planted evidence of his offshore gambling, a vice he didn't have, but one she had meticulously fabricated through a series of mirrored transactions in Macau. By the time he realized he was broke, he would also realize he was the prime suspect in a federal money laundering investigation. Catherine felt a cold, sharp thrill run through her. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the silence. For a decade, she had been the silent wife, the quiet observer, the one who took the insults and the infidelity with a graceful nod. Now, the silence was her weapon, and Richard was about to find out how loud it could get. The SUV sped through the gates of the estate, the iron bars swinging shut behind them. Catherine watched them close in the rearview mirror. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. All that was left was to watch the empire burn. "Drive," she said softly. "We have a lot of work to do before the sun comes up." The act ended not with a whimper, but with the soft hum of a high-performance engine accelerating into the dark, leaving a world of illusions behind in the rain. Catherine Blackstone was no longer a victim. She was the architect of a ruin so complete it would be studied by accountants for decades, and the best part, Richard still thought he was the one who had won. The rain continued to fall, washing away the tracks of the car, leaving the mansion standing alone in its stolen grandeur, a tomb of marble and glass waiting for its inhabitant to realize he was already buried. Catherine smiled again, a genuine, terrifying expression of pure, unadulterated freedom. The hunt had truly begun. They say luxury has a scent. In the back of Marcus's custom-built limousine, it smells like expensive Italian leather and cedar wood. But to Catherine today, it smells like a tomb. Catherine enters the car. The door closes with a heavy, expensive thud, a sound that isolates her from the rest of the world. Marcus is already inside, looking at his gold watch, his face a mask of practiced indifference. "You're 3 minutes late, Catherine," he says coldly. "Precision is what built this empire. Don't let your domestic habits soften your edge." Catherine looks at him. She doesn't speak. She sits, her back straight, her hands folded over her designer clutch. Inside that clutch is the diamond bracelet. It feels like a branding iron through the fabric. Precision. He talks about precision as if he did it alone, as if 20 years of my life weren't the very foundation he stands on. We started with nothing but a shared hunger. I was the one who stayed up until 4 a.m. fixing his spreadsheets. I was the one who sold my grandmother's engagement ring to pay for our first office lease. I was the silent partner, the architect of his reputation, the woman who smoothed over every rough edge until Marcus Sterling looked like a god of industry. 20 years. 2 decades of being his shadow, his advisor, his silent wife. I thought we were building a legacy together. I thought the Sterling Empire was our child. And then there was this, my anniversary gift. Or so I thought. 2 days ago, Catherine was in Marcus's home office, looking for a misplaced document. She opened a drawer and finds a jewelry box from Tiffany & Co. She opened it, smiling. expecting a surprise for their upcoming anniversary. It's a stunning diamond bracelet with a custom engraving. She turned the bracelet over. Her smile faded. The engraving read, "To my one and only, L. Forever yours, M. L." Not C for Catherine. L. The realization didn't hit me like a wave. It hit me like a gunshot. Clear, precise, fatal. Still in the office, she heard Marcus approaching. She quickly put the box back and hid behind the heavy velvet curtains. Marcus entered, talking on his private cell phone. His voice was different. Warm, intimate. A voice she hasn't heard in a decade. "I know, Lydia. It's beautiful, isn't it? I picked it out myself. It matches your eyes. I'll have the jeweler deliver it to your penthouse this evening. Catherine, please." She's too busy playing the perfect hostess to notice anything. She's part of the furniture now. Catherine's face behind the curtain hardened into ice. She didn't cry. Back in the car, Catherine snaps the jewelry box shut. The sound is sharp, like a bone breaking. "What was that?" Marcus asks, not looking up from his tablet. "Just thinking about the party tonight, Marcus," Catherine replies, her voice steady and melodic. "It's a big milestone. 20 years of partnership." Marcus smirks. "Indeed. Make sure the vintage wine is decanted properly. The board members are coming. Appearances are everything today." Catherine looks at him. A small, chilling smile touches her lips. "Oh, I agree, Marcus. Appearances are everything. And tonight, everyone is going to see exactly what you've built. He thinks I am part of the furniture. He thinks I am a silent witness to my own erasure. But he forgets one thing about shadows. They are always there, watching, waiting for the light to shift. The empire he built on my back is about to become his cage. He gave me diamonds to hide his sins. I'm going to use them to bury him." The mahogany doors of Richard's home office remained closed, a silent barrier between Catherine's domestic prison and the engine of his power. To the world and to Richard, Catherine was a broken bird, recovering from the accident that had left her voice box shattered. She moved through the corridors of the mansion like a spectre, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. She had learned a valuable lesson. People don't look at things they think they own. Richard looked through her, not at her. He spoke over her, assuming her silence was synonymous with a lack of thought. Catherine began her transformation. She didn't need to leave the house to build a dossier. She just needed to stay awake when the rest of the world, and Richard's guard, was down. She became the ghost of the estate. It was 2:14 a.m. The rhythmic snoring from the master bedroom confirmed Richard was deep in a scotch-induced slumber. Catherine slipped out of bed, her movements fluid and practiced. She wore dark silk, blending into the shadows of the hallway. She reached the office. Richard, arrogant in his belief that no one in the house had the intellect or the courage to challenge him, used a predictable password, the date of his first $1 million acquisition. Catherine sat at the desk, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her cold, sharp eyes. She wasn't just looking for Mistress's names anymore. She was looking for the blood that fed the beast. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She had spent the last week cleaning the office while Richard was at work, subtly noting the arrangement of his files. Now she accessed the encrypted folders. She found the Project Zenith files. On the surface, it looked like a standard real estate development deal. But Catherine had a degree in finance she'd buried under years of charity luncheons. She began to cross-reference the payments. There it was. Kickbacks. Shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands were receiving consulting fees from contractors working on city-funded projects. The amounts were staggering. $200,000 here, $500,000 there. It wasn't just greed, it was systemic corruption. She discovered the Black Ledger, a digital spreadsheet hidden within a cache of mundane family photos. It detailed the discrepancy between Richard's declared income and his actual liquid assets. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a professional tax evader on a grand scale. The floorboard outside the office creaked. Catherine froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of marble. She didn't panic. She didn't shut the laptop. The light would be too obvious. Instead, she quickly minimized the window and pulled up a browser tab she'd kept ready. Luxury Interior Design Trends 2026. The door pushed open. It was Richard, rubbing his eyes, smelling of expensive cigars and sweat. "Catherine," he growled, his voice thick with sleep. "What the hell are you doing up?" She turned slowly, holding up a physical catalogue of curtains she'd brought with her. She pointed to a fabric sample and then to the window, her expression one of innocent, late-night obsession. She made a soft, frustrated sound in her throat, pointing to her throat and then the screen, miming that she couldn't sleep and was looking at pretty things to distract herself. Richard sighed, a mix of pity and annoyance. "It's 3 a.m. Go back to bed. You're obsessing over curtains like a mental patient." He didn't even look at the screen. He turned and walked back toward the bedroom. Once the door clicked shut, Catherine didn't move for 5 minutes. Then, she pulled a small, high-capacity encrypted flash drive from the hem of her robe. She began the download. The Project Zenith files, the Black Ledger, the emails to the city council members. Everything flowed into her possession. As the progress bar reached 100%, a predatory smile touched her lips. Richard thought he had silenced her by breaking her physical voice. He had no idea that she was about to find a voice that would resonate through the halls of justice and the boardrooms of his rivals. She wasn't just a wife anymore. She was the architect of his ruin. She carefully deleted her browser history, wiped the keyboard with a microfiber cloth to remove any stray oils, and exited the office. In the hallway, she caught her reflection in a gold-rimmed mirror. The silent wife was gone. In her place stood a woman who had just found the detonator to her husband's entire life. She just needed to decide when to press the button. The glow of the tablet screen was the only light in the small, forgotten library on the 3rd floor. Catherine sat amidst leather-bound books that Richard kept only for show. He never came here. He preferred the glass and steel of his modern office. Catherine's fingers scrolled through the digitized files she had exfiltrated from Richard's Black Ledger. But it wasn't the corruption in Project Zenith that caught her eye tonight. It was a folder labeled Estate Acquisition 2018. She remembered that year. It was when Richard had surprised her with this mansion, claiming he had bought it as a monument to their love. At the time, she was still reeling from her father's sudden death, her grief making her a passive observer in her own life. She opened a scanned copy of the original deed. Her breath hitched. Catherine's father hadn't been a wealthy man by Richard's standards, but he had been careful. The mansion hadn't been bought by Richard in a traditional sense. It had been part of a complex land swap involving her father's old textile mill, the very mill Richard had liquidated to jumpstart his empire. As she passed the legalese, the truth emerged with the clarity of a diamond. Her father had placed the mansion into a generation-skipping trust for Catherine. Richard, in his typical arrogance, had instructed his lawyers to fix the paperwork so he could use the property as collateral for his massive loans. His legal team had filed a series of amendments, but they had missed one critical detail: the reversionary interest clause. The clause stated that if the property was ever used to facilitate illicit financial activities, or was subjected to unauthorized encumbrances by a third party, the title would automatically and irrevocably vest solely in the beneficiary. By using the mansion as the headquarters for his shell companies and the illegal kickbacks of Project Zenith, Richard had inadvertently triggered the clause. Legal ownership hadn't just shifted, it had reverted to Catherine 3 years ago. Richard didn't own the walls he slept within. He didn't own the floor he walked on. He was a squatter in Catherine's house. A cold, sharp laugh bubbled up in Catherine's throat, but she swallowed it. She couldn't afford a sound. Instead, she opened an encrypted communication app she'd installed under a hidden partition. "Target acquired," she typed to an anonymous contact, a disgraced former auditor who had been ruined by Richard years ago and was now living in Singapore. "The deed is mine. Start the liquidation of the secondary assets linked to the estate." Catherine wasn't just going to take the house, she was going to bleed him dry using the very tools he'd taught her. Since the mansion was technically hers, every sub-corporation registered to this address was now legally under her purview if she chose to assert her right. She didn't reveal herself to the banks yet. Instead, she began harvesting. Over the next week, Catherine moved with the precision of a surgeon, while Richard was out closing deals, which Catherine now knew were just elaborate bribes. She was sitting in the parlour, sipping tea and authorizing the sale of high-value liquid assets. She started with the art. Richard had a collection of post-war expressionist paintings, insured for millions, all held by a holding company tied to the mansion's deed. Catherine contacted a boutique auction house in London. "The pieces are being moved for private restoration," the email read. In reality, they were being sold to a private collector in Qatar. The funds, 4.2 million, didn't go into the joint account. They flowed into a newly established offshore vehicle, the Phoenix Trust. Next came the luxury fleet. 2 of the vintage Ferraris stored in the climate-controlled garage were technically corporate assets of the estate. Catherine signed the digital transfer papers. By the time Richard noticed they were missing, they would be on a cargo plane to Zurich. Catherine stood by the window, watching a black SUV pull into the driveway. It wasn't Richard. It was a private courier. She met him at the side entrance. She handed him a sealed envelope containing the physical stock certificates she'd borrowed from Richard's safe. These were bearer bonds, old school, untraceable, and worth a fortune. The Phoenix Trust was growing. It wasn't just a bank account. It was her war chest. She looked at her reflection in the glass. She looked like the same dutiful, silent wife. Her throat was still scarred, her voice still a rasping ghost of what it once was. But her eyes were those of a queen who had just realized the king was playing on her board. That evening, Richard returned home, looking haggard. Project Zenith was hitting regulatory snags that Catherine had anonymously tipped off to the local press. "You look pale, Catherine," Richard muttered, pouring himself a double scotch. "Is the house too cold? I told the staff to turn up the heat." Catherine shook her head slowly, offering him a submissive, thin smile. She walked over and straightened his tie, her touch lingering just a second too long near his throat. "If only you knew, Richard," she thought. "You're worrying about the heat while I'm dismantling the furnace." "I'm going to need you to sign some papers tomorrow," he said, not looking at her. "Just some routine updates for the estate. Nothing for your pretty little head to worry about." Catherine nodded obediently. She would sign them, but she would sign them with a pen that had already written his obituary. As Richard walked toward his office, the office she now legally owned, Catherine felt a surge of power so intoxicating it nearly made her dizzy. The liquidation had begun. The king was losing his gold, and soon she would reclaim the crown. The mahogany desk in Richard's home office was cluttered with blueprints for Project Zenith. Richard paced the room, his voice booming with the false bravado of a man who didn't realize the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "I don't care about the delays," he snapped into his phone. "Use the mansion as the anchor. If the city sees the estate is fully pledged to the project, they'll back off. It's a symbol of stability." He downed the rest of his scotch. To Richard, the mansion was his ultimate collateral, the old money shield that protected his new money schemes. He believed that as long as he held the deed, he was untouchable. In the doorway, Catherine stood in silence, holding a tray. She had heard everything, a symbol of stability. How ironic that he was trying to anchor his sinking ship to a pier that she had already dismantled. Earlier that morning, Catherine had met with her secret legal counsel. They sat in a nondescript cafe far from the elite circles Richard frequented. "The Phoenix Holding Group is fully incorporated, Catherine," the lawyer whispered, sliding a tablet across the table. "The digital infrastructure is ironclad. If you execute the sale today, the title transfer will be instantaneous via the blockchain-backed registry. It's fast, quiet, and irreversible." Catherine looked at the document. Bill of sale, 1245, Blackwood Estate. Seller, Catherine Thorne. Buyer, Phoenix Global Holdings, LLC. The price was a nominal $1. Since Catherine was both the seller and the secret beneficiary of the buyer, she was effectively moving the house from her left hand to her right into a vault Richard could never pick. She tapped the digital signature field. The deal was done. Richard entered the dining room that evening with a stack of papers. He looked triumphant, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Catherine, my love," he said, his voice oily. "I've had my lawyers draw up a consolidation agreement. We're folding the estate into a new family trust. It'll protect us from the vultures at the SEC. I just need your signature to waive any residual interest from your father's old claims." He placed the papers on the table and handed her a gold-plated pen. "It's for our future. This is how we save the house." Catherine looked at the papers. They were a trap designed to strip her of her rights. Instead of resisting, she played the part of the grateful, overwhelmed wife. She let out a small, raspy sound, a mimicry of a sob, and nodded. As she leaned over the table, she accidentally knocked over a vase of lilies. Water flooded the documents. "Oh, Richard, I'm so sorry!" She gestured wildly, her face a mask of panicked apology. "God damn it, Catherine!" Richard roared, snatching the soaked papers. "You're so clumsy! These were the originals!" Inside, she was cold as ice. She knew he had backups, but this delay bought her the hours she needed for the Phoenix Holding Group's purchase to be recorded in the state database. While Richard screamed at his secretary to print new copies, Catherine retired to her library. She opened her laptop and watched the live feed of the county's property records. Status: updated. New owner: Phoenix Global Holdings, LLC. She had done more than just move the title. She had used the liquid assets she harvested to pay off the small mortgage Richard had taken out against the property. By clearing the debt, she had severed the bank's connection to the house. Richard was no longer the master of the house. He was, in the eyes of the law, a guest who had overstayed his welcome. Late that night, Richard finally got Catherine to sign the new papers. He didn't check them closely. He was too busy boasting. He signed his own name with a flourish, believing he had just trapped Catherine. "To us," he said, raising a glass of champagne. "To the masters of the mansion." Catherine raised her glass in return. She didn't drink. She just watched him walk through the halls, touching the walls as if he owned them. He went to the balcony and looked out over the gardens. "Everything the light touches is mine, Catherine. I built this. I own this." Catherine stood behind him, her shadow stretching long. "Enjoy your view, Richard," she thought, "because tonight you're sleeping in my house, and tomorrow I might just decide to start charging you rent." The next morning, Richard woke up to find his favorite lounge chair missing from the study. Then he noticed the grand piano in the foyer was gone. "Where is the furniture?" he bellowed at the head butler. The butler, who had received a large bonus from an anonymous source, simply bowed. "I believe the owners requested a change in decor, sir." "The owners? I am the owner!" Richard screamed. But when he went to his safe, he found only a small printed card with a stylized Phoenix logo. Underneath it, in elegant script, were the words, "Tenant, Richard Thorne. Status, at sufferance." The walls were closing in, and for the first time, Richard felt a chill that no amount of heating could fix. The mansion was no longer a home. It was a logistics hub. While Richard was out at a strategic retreat at a luxury hotel downtown, a retreat Catherine knew was actually a 3-day tryst with Amber, Catherine sat in the center of the grand foyer, a tablet in hand. Around her, a team of professional movers, dressed in elite restoration and maintenance uniforms, worked with surgical precision. They weren't just moving boxes, they were dismantling Richard's world. The 18th century French tapestry in the dining hall, Catherine signed to her lead foreman, who translated her gestures into a digital checklist. The climate-controlled wine collection, every bottle of 1945 Romanée Conti. It all goes to the secure facility in New Jersey. The foreman nodded. "And the maintenance paperwork for the gate security, ma'am?" Catherine offered a thin, sharp smile. She handed him a stack of forged work orders. To anyone passing by, It looked like a standard high-end refurbishment. In reality, the house was being hollowed out. 30 miles away, in a penthouse suite overlooking the city, Richard toasted to his success. Amber, draped in diamonds he had bought with money he no longer technically possessed, laughed at his jokes. "You seem lighter, Richard," Amber purred, tracing the line of his jaw. "The stress of the Zenith project is finally lifting." Richard laughed, a booming, arrogant sound. "The project is secure, Amber. I'm the silent partner at home. She's finally behaving. I've got her signing everything I put in front of her. She's too broken to fight back." He checked his phone. A notification from the mansion's smart home system showed maintenance crew on site. He dismissed it with a flick of his thumb. Catherine had told him the HVAC system needed a total overhaul and the art needed preventative preservation due to a humidity leak. "Let her play decorator," Richard muttered, pulling Amber closer. "It keeps her quiet while I build our empire." Back at the estate, the silence was eerie. The maintenance crew had already cleared the master study, Richard's solid oak desk, his collection of rare ivory carvings, and the Persian rugs that had cost more than a suburban house were gone. Catherine walked into the wine cellar. This was Richard's pride, a collection of over 3,000 bottles, some worth more than $50,000 each. The movers worked quickly, placing the bottles into specialized shock-absorbent crates. Catherine picked up a bottle of Chateau Margaux, the one Richard had planned to open to celebrate the closing of Project Zenith. She handed it to a worker. "This one goes into my private storage," she wrote on a notepad. "The rest? List them for private auction through the Singapore contact." By sunset, the cellar was an empty, echoing stone room. The maintenance was nearly complete. As the last truck pulled away, Catherine returned to the library. It was the only room she hadn't touched. It was her sanctuary. She sat at her laptop, watching the GPS trackers on the moving trucks. They were all headed to various secure, climate-controlled warehouses owned by Phoenix Global Holdings. She then logged into the mansion's security system. She began a scripted update that would put the cameras on a loop for the next 48 hours. To Richard, looking at his phone, everything would appear normal. The front gate would show a static image of a peaceful driveway. The foyer would show the grand piano, even though it was currently in a crate halfway to a buyer in London. She was erasing the evidence of her theft in real time, replacing reality with a digital ghost of the life they once shared. Catherine walked through the empty halls. The echoes of her own footsteps were the only sound. The mansion felt larger now, a cavernous ribcage of a beast she had finally killed. She reached Richard's bedside table. She placed a small, elegant envelope there. It was empty, except for a scent, the perfume her mother used to wear, the same scent Catherine wore the day Richard had proposed to her, in a move that was more of a corporate merger than a romance. She wasn't just taking his things. She was taking the ground from beneath his feet. When he returned from his weekend with Amber, he wouldn't be walking into a home. He would be walking into a tomb. Catherine stood on the grand staircase, looking down at the empty foyer. The marble floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the lack of furniture. She picked up her phone and sent a single message to her legal team. "The shell is empty. Prepare the eviction notice for Monday morning." She felt no guilt. Every item she had removed had been bought with her family's legacy or stolen from the public through Richard's corruption. She wasn't a thief. She was a liquidator. As the moon rose over the estate, Catherine sat on the floor of the empty master bedroom, leaning against the cold wall. For the first time in years, she felt like the house finally belonged to her. Not because of a deed, but because she was the only thing left inside it. The silent wife was no longer waiting for the storm. She was the storm. Monday morning at Sterling Group headquarters began not with the usual low hum of corporate productivity, but with the rhythmic, heavy thud of combat boots and the sharp click of high-end Oxfords. A phalanx of 18 individuals, clad in charcoal suits and carrying high-capacity scanners, marched through the glass and steel lobby. At their head was Marcus Thorne, the city's most feared forensic auditor. He didn't stop at the reception desk. He didn't ask for a visitor's pass. He simply held up a court-stamped warrant that bore the official seal of the State Superior Court. "External audit," Thorne announced, his voice cutting through the morning chatter like a blade. "Under the suspicion of systemic embezzlement, tax evasion, and racketeering. All servers are to be mirrored immediately. All physical files in the C-suite are to be surrendered." The security guards, usually so quick to intercept uninvited guests, stood frozen. They recognized the signatures on the warrants. They also recognized the two uniformed officers flanking Thorne. The Sterling Group, Richard's untouchable empire, was no longer a fortress. It was a crime scene. Richard Sterling was in the middle of a conference call, boasting about the imminent success of Project Zenith, when his office door was practically kicked open. He didn't even have time to yell before Marcus Thorne was standing over his desk. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, slamming his phone down. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'll have your licenses revoked by lunch." Thorne didn't blink. He placed a heavy, leather-bound folder on Richard's desk. "Mr. Sterling, you are currently under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the IRS, and the State Attorney General's office. This audit was triggered by a whistleblower with Level 5 clearance and a cache of encrypted ledgers dating back 7 years. Richard's face went from a furious red to a sickly, ashen grey. Whistleblower. Level 5. Only 3 people had that kind of access. 2 of them were his most loyal VPs, currently on a bonus vacation in the Maldives. The third. The silent partner. Richard whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Catherine." "She's more than a partner, Mr. Sterling," Thorne said, signaling his team to begin dismantling Richard's workstation. "She's the primary complainant, and she's provided a roadmap to every offshore account you've ever touched." While the chaos erupted at Sterling Group, Catherine sat in a quiet, sun-drenched office 30 floors above the city. This was the headquarters of Vanguard Legal, the firm she had been funding in secret for 18 months. Spread across the massive mahogany table were the final instruments of Richard's destruction. First, the final divorce decree. It wasn't just a request for separation. It was a scorched earth filing. Because of the infidelity and financial malfeasance clauses she had subtly inserted into their prenuptial agreement years ago, clauses Richard had signed without reading during his period of greatest arrogance, she was entitled to 90% of his remaining liquid assets and 100% of the Sterling family estate. Next to it lay the warrants for seizure. These were already being executed. As she watched the news on a silent monitor, she saw the live feed of Sterling Group. She saw Richard being escorted out of the building, not in handcuffs yet, but with the hollow, haunted look of a man who had just seen his soul's price tag. Catherine picked up a sleek fountain pen. She didn't hesitate. With a fluid, graceful motion, she signed her name on the final page of the divorce papers. "Is the mansion secure?" She signed to her lead attorney, Sarah Jenkins. Sarah nodded. "The eviction notice was served an hour ago. By the time Richard gets home from the precinct, the locks will be changed, the gates will be reinforced, and he'll find his mansion is as empty as his promises." The audit wasn't just hitting the office. A secondary team had arrived at Amber's luxury penthouse, the one Richard had gifted her using company funds. Amber stood in the doorway, clutching a silk robe, as movers began tagging her jewelry, her designer bags, and the $200,000 grand piano Richard had bought her for their 6-month anniversary. "You can't do this!" Amber screamed at the federal agents. "Richard bought these for me! They're gifts!" "Actually, ma'am," one of the agents said, holding up a digital tablet, "these items were purchased using embezzled funds from the Zenith Project's Infrastructure Fund. Under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, these are proceeds of crime. They are now property of the state, pending liquidation to reimburse the Sterling Group's legitimate shareholders." Amber reached for her phone to call Richard, but the screen was dark, Her service had been cut. Her credit cards, all linked to Richard's corporate accounts, had been flagged and frozen. The gold-plated life she had built on Catherine's silence was evaporating. Catherine stood by the window of the law firm, looking out at the city she now effectively controlled. For years, she had been the silent wife, the background character in Richard's grand narrative. She had played the role of the broken, mute socialite to perfection, letting him underestimate her until his own ego became his blindfold. She picked up her phone and sent a final message to Marcus Thorne at the audit site. Check the floorboards in the private vault. The double-entry ledgers are there. She knew Richard would try to hide the black books. He thought he was clever. He didn't realize that she was the one who had helped his father design that vault 20 years ago. Catherine took a sip of her tea, her favorite Earl Grey, the scent of bergamot grounding her. Phase 2 was complete. Richard was broke. Amber was being evicted. And Sterling Group was being torn apart by the very system Richard thought he owned. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the skyline, Catherine felt a profound peace. The storm hadn't just passed. It had cleared the air. Tomorrow, the world would learn the name of the woman who brought down an empire. For the first time, she wouldn't have to say a word for them to hear her loud and clear. The silence in the Sterling mansion was no longer peaceful. It was skeletal. Richard stood in the center of the grand foyer, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. Around him, the evidence of his pillaging lay in pathetic piles. Cardboard boxes, half-taped and haphazardly stacked, sat like tombstones for a life he was losing. But they were empty. He had spent the last 3 hours frantically trying to gather what remained of the liquid assets he'd stashed. Jewelry, gold watches, the small safes he thought only he knew the codes to. Every single one was empty. The velvet linings of the jewelry boxes mocked him with their indentations, where diamonds and emeralds once rested. "Amber!" he shouted, his voice cracking and echoing off the cold marble walls. "Amber! Where the hell are you?" There was no answer. The heavy silence of the house was punctuated only by the distant hum of the ventilation system. He ran to the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtains. Her car was gone. The driveway was a vacant stretch of grey gravel under the moonlight. She hadn't just left. She had cleaned him out. Panic, cold and visceral, coiled in his gut. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. He didn't call Amber. He knew she was gone. He called the one person he had spent 3 years trying to bury. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. 3. He was about to scream into the void when the line clicked open. "I wondered how long it would take for you to realize the walls were closing in, Richard." Catherine's voice was like a blade of ice, smooth, sharp, and utterly devoid of the warmth he had once manipulated so easily. "You bitch!" Richard roared, pacing the empty foyer, kicking a stack of boxes that collapsed with a hollow thud. "What have you done? Where is everything? Where is Amber?" He heard a soft, melodic laugh on the other end, a sound that chilled him more than any scream could have. "Amber was never yours, Richard. She was an investment, one that paid off handsomely the moment she walked out that door with the last of your retirement fund. Consider it her commission for 3 years of pretending to endure your company." Richard's knees hit the floor. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Amber hadn't been a partner, she'd been a plant, or perhaps just a smarter shark than he was. "I'll kill you," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "I'll find you, and I'll—" "You'll do nothing," Catherine interrupted, her tone shifting to a terrifying clinical calm. "Because you no longer have the standing to do anything. Do you know where I am right now, Richard? I'm sitting in a very comfortable office, watching the sunrise over the city, and on the desk in front of me is the completed forensic audit of the Sterling Group." "That's impossible," Richard stammered. "I burned those records. I scrubbed the servers." "You scrubbed the mirrors, Richard. You never looked at the foundation. I've been the silent shadow in your system for 18 months. Every offshore transfer, every consultation fee paid to shell companies, Every cent you bled from my father's legacy. It's all here, neatly bound and digitally watermarked. Richard looked around the foyer. The shadows seemed to grow longer, reaching for him. I can fix it. We can talk about this, Catherine. Think of the family name. The family name is Sterling, Richard. Your name is an asterisk in a divorce filing that was finalized an hour ago, she said, and he could almost hear the smile in her voice. And as for the fixing, it's a bit late for that. The Sterling Group audit isn't just on my desk. Copies were delivered to the public prosecutor's office and the Financial Crimes Division 20 minutes ago. The warrants are being signed as we speak. No, the word was a broken whisper. Yes, Catherine continued, relentless. But there's one more thing you should know. You're currently trespassing. You see, the mansion wasn't part of the corporate assets you tried to seize. It was held in a private trust in my name. A gift from my father that your lawyers were too incompetent to find. The security team is on their way to escort you off the property. Or, if they're slow, the police will simply find you there when they arrive to arrest you for embezzlement and grand larceny. Catherine, please, Richard pleaded, his bravado completely shattered. He looked at the empty boxes, the empty house, and the empty future stretching out before him. I have nothing. She took everything. Exactly, Catherine said. You're finally exactly what you were when I met you. A hollow man in a borrowed suit. Goodbye, Richard. Don't bother calling back. This number is already being disconnected. The line went dead. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard sat on the cold floor, surrounded by the cardboard remains of his empire. In the distance, the first faint wail of a siren began to tear through the night air, growing louder with every passing second. He reached for a box, hoping to find something, anything he had missed. He pulled the flaps open. Inside was a single white envelope. He tore it open with trembling hands. Inside was a photograph, taken from a distance, of him and Amber laughing on the balcony months ago. On the back, in Catherine's elegant script, were 4 words: "The silence is yours." The sirens were at the gates now. The blue and red lights began to pulse against the frosted glass of the front doors, casting a rhythmic, police-state glow over the man who had thought he could own the world. Richard closed his eyes, the empty boxes his only company, as the sound of heavy boots began to hammer against the stone steps outside. He was an intruder in his own life, and the locks had all been changed. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers strobed against the neoclassical facade of the Sterling mansion, turning the symbol of Richard's stolen power into a frantic, pulsing crime scene. For years, this house had been a fortress of silence and manipulation. Now, it was a stage for his public disintegration. Richard didn't resist when the heavy oak doors were pushed open. He couldn't. He was still sitting on the cold marble floor of the foyer, surrounded by the empty cardboard boxes that mocked his greed. The lead detective, a woman with eyes that had seen 1,000 Richards, didn't even need to raise her voice. Richard Vance, you're under arrest for grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and multiple counts of financial fraud, she said, her voice cutting through the hollow air. Stand up, hands behind your back. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Richard looked up, his eyes bloodshot and searching the shadows. Where is she? He rasped. Where is Catherine? The complainant is in a secure location, Mr. Vance, the detective replied, hauling him to his feet. And she's provided enough digital evidence to keep a grand jury busy for a decade. Let's go. As they led him down the stone steps, a silver sedan idling at the edge of the property caught his eye. The passenger window rolled down just an inch. He saw the flash of blonde hair, Amber. For a fleeting second, a spark of hope flared in his chest. Maybe she hadn't taken everything. Maybe she was waiting for him. But as the police car door opened, he saw her face clearly. She wasn't looking at him with regret or love. She was looking at her phone, her expression bored as she checked a bank balance that had grown by 7 figures overnight. She glanced up once, met his desperate gaze with a look of utter indifference, and whispered something to the driver. The sedan pulled away. its taillights disappearing into the night. She hadn't just abandoned him. She had erased him the moment his utility hit zero. 6 months later, the fallout of the Sterling Group scandal had settled into a grim, predictable rhythm. Richard sat in a fluorescent-lit visitation room, his tailored suits replaced by a coarse orange jumpsuit that chafed his skin. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and grey. Across from him sat his court-appointed attorney, a man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "The plea deal is off the table, Richard," the lawyer said, tapping a stack of documents. "The evidence Catherine provided, the ghost logs from the server you thought you scrubbed, it's irrefutable. You were bleeding the company dry while she was recovering. The jury isn't going to show mercy to a man who tried to institutionalize his wife to steal her inheritance." "I built that company," Richard shouted, his voice cracking. "I made it what it was." "No," the lawyer countered coldly. "You managed it into the ground. Catherine is the one rebuilding it, or rather, what's left of it." Richard slumped back in his chair. The silence of the prison cell was different from the silence of the mansion. It was heavy, permanent, and smelled of floor wax and failure. He had nothing left. No money, no allies, and certainly no Amber. The last he'd heard, she had been spotted on a yacht in the Mediterranean with a tech mogul. He was just a footnote in her climb to the top. On the same day, Richard's sentencing was announced, 20 years with no possibility of early parole. The gates of the Sterling mansion opened for a very different reason. The heavy, "For Sale" sign had been replaced by a sleek, modern plaque, the Eleanor Sterling Foundation. Catherine stood on the front lawn, the morning sun warming her face. She looked vibrant, her eyes clear and filled with a quiet, fierce purpose. She wasn't the silent wife anymore. She was a woman who had reclaimed her voice and was now using it to amplify others. A crowd of reporters and local dignitaries gathered as she stepped toward the microphone. Behind her, the mansion's interior had been transformed. The cold, sterile displays of wealth were gone, replaced by warm common areas, counseling rooms, and legal offices. "For too long, this house was a place of silence," Catherine began, her voice steady and resonant. "It was a place where power was used to diminish, and where voices were systematically erased. But today, that ends. The Sterling Foundation is dedicated to providing legal, financial, and psychological support to women facing domestic and corporate abuse. We are here to ensure that no one else has to fight their way out of the shadows alone." The applause was deafening, but Catherine barely heard it. She looked up at the balcony where Richard had once stood, looking down on her like a master over a servant. Now, a group of women, the first residents of the foundation, stood there, looking out at the horizon with hope. As the event wound down, Catherine's assistant approached her. "The final transfer from the Vance liquidation account just cleared, Catherine. It's exactly the amount needed to fund the satellite offices in the city." Catherine nodded, a small, satisfied smile touching her lips. Richard's greed had built the foundation's endowment. His attempt to destroy her had provided the very tools she was using to save others. It was the ultimate karma, a poetic justice that required no further words. She took one last look at the house. It was no longer a monument to a stolen legacy. It was a sanctuary. "Let's get to work," she said. Catherine turned and walked into the light of the foyer, leaving the ghosts of the past exactly where they belonged, in the silence. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the new Sterling estate, a stark contrast to the cold, imposing shadows of the old mansion. Here, the air smelled of salt and wild lavender, and the house, a modest but elegant structure of glass and reclaimed wood, seemed to grow out of the earth rather than conquer it. Catherine stood on the wraparound deck, a cup of tea warming her hands, watching the sun burn through the grey veil of the Atlantic. For the first time in a decade, the silence wasn't a cage, it was a sanctuary. In the weeks following the opening of the Eleanor Sterling Foundation, Catherine had retreated here, to this quiet corner of the coast she had purchased with the very last of her personal inheritance. The part Richard had never been able to touch. It was her own space, untainted by the ghosts of the Vance legacy or the cold calculations of the corporate world she had dismantled. Her phone buzzed on the wooden table behind her. It was a message from her lead counsel at the foundation. The final audit of the Vance liquidation is complete, Catherine. Every cent of the embezzled funds has been redirected to the survivor advocacy programs. Richard's last appeal was denied this morning. He'll be serving the full term. Catherine didn't feel the surge of triumph she had expected. Instead, she felt a profound sense of lightness, as if a heavy iron cloak had finally slipped from her shoulders. She looked out at the ocean, the waves rhythmic and indifferent to the petty dramas of men. Richard was exactly where he belonged, trapped in a world of his own making, a world defined by walls, bars, and the suffocating weight of his own choices. Later that afternoon, a sleek black SUV pulled up the gravel driveway. Marcus stepped out, looking uncharacteristically relaxed in a linen shirt and dark jeans. He carried a small, leather-bound folder under his arm. "I hope I'm not interrupting the peace," he said, joining her on the deck. "The peace is here to stay, Marcus," Catherine replied, offering him a smile that reached her eyes. "What brings you all the way out here?" He handed her the folder. The final board minutes from the Sterling Group's dissolution. The transition to the non-profit model is 100% complete. You're officially no longer the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. You're just Catherine. She ran her hand over the leather cover. Just Catherine. I like the sound of that. There's one more thing, Marcus added, his expression softening. A letter came to the foundation office. It was addressed to the woman who outsmarted the devil. It was from one of the first residents, the woman you helped relocate last month. She started her own business, a small bakery in the city. She wanted you to know that for the first time in 15 years, she woke up without fear. Catherine felt a lump form in her throat. This was the real victory. Not the bank accounts, not the legal wins, and certainly not the public disgrace of her ex-husband. It was the ripple effect of a single voice refusing to be silenced. "That's why we did it, Marcus," she whispered. "That's the only thing that matters." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching a pair of ospreys circle high above the cliffs. "What's next for you?" Marcus asked. "The foundation is running itself now. You have the resources to go anywhere, do anything." Catherine looked back at the house, through the wide glass doors where her drafting table sat covered in new designs, not for corporate headquarters or luxury penthouses, but for sustainable, low-income housing communities. "I spent years being a character in Richard's story," she said. "Then I spent a year being the architect of his downfall. Now, I think I'll just spend some time being the architect of my own life. I want to build things that last, Marcus. Things that give people a foundation, not just a roof." Marcus nodded, a look of genuine respect in his eyes. "I have no doubt you will." As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Catherine walked down to the edge of the cliffs. In her hand, she held a small silver key, the original key to the Sterling Mansion's front door. It was a relic of a life that felt like a fever dream now. She looked at the key, reflecting the dying light. It represented everything Richard had craved. Access, ownership, the power to lock things away. To him, this piece of metal was a scepter. To her, it was a reminder of the night she had realized that the only door that truly mattered was the one inside her own mind. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed the key into the abyss. It caught the light one last time, before vanishing into the churning white foam of the Atlantic. The mansion revenge was complete, but the revenge wasn't in the destruction of the house or the imprisonment of the man. The real revenge was in the reclamation of her soul. Richard Vance sat in a 6 by 9 foot cell, surrounded by the crushing weight of his own greed, forever haunted by the silence of the woman he thought he had broken. Catherine Sterling stood on the edge of the world, her hair whipped by the wind, her voice clear and strong, and her heart finally, irrevocably free. She turned away from the cliff and walked back toward her home, her footsteps steady on the earth. The shadows were lengthening, but for the first time in her life, Catherine wasn't afraid of the dark. She knew exactly who she was, and she knew that the light she had found within herself would never be extinguished again. The silence was over. The story was hers.